afternoon, everyone. How's everyone feeling? Lunch? Walking right into a session? Oh, sorry. How's everyone feeling? So this is the workshop regarding providing specialized services for LGBTQ young people that do not violate federal law. Very important topic. So if that's what you want to learn about this afternoon, you're in the right place. Friendly reminder for anyone that needs CEU credits, you can sign in at the table right outside the door. And so our facilitators for this session today, first we have Nadia Swanson. Nadia uses they, them pronouns, and they are the Director of Training and Advocacy at the Alifari Center in New York City. And then we have Curry Cook, who is the Senior Counsel and Director of Youth in Out-of-Home Care, the Director of the Youth in Out-of-Home Care Project at Lambda Legal. So I'll hand it over to you. What's Amaya's password? No. The computer closed out, and now it's the other person's little login. But I know what's next. Next is telling you more about who I am. So, I'm Nadia Swanson at the Alifari Center. The Alifari Center is located in New York City. We are the largest and most comprehensive service for LGBTQ homeless youth. Thank you. And that includes our drop-in center, which is 365, 24/7, and holds all of our comprehensive services and all the wraparound services. And then we have emergency housing and transitional housing, having 152 young people with us in a mix of crisis overnight and emergency and transitional housing, and transgender housing. And we also provide national and international technical assistance and model replication and advocacy.
And hi, everyone. My name's Curry Cook. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a lawyer with Lambda Legal, and I direct the Youth in Out-of-Home Care Project, which is like the mouthful we use to describe just young people that are in government care or custody or receiving services through government-funded contractors, grantees, kind of any reason you might be experiencing out-of-home care as a young person. Lambda Legal is about to turn 50, actually. And we're the oldest and largest nonprofit law firm dedicated to achieving full equality for LGBTQ plus people and everyone living with HIV. A lot of what we do is impact litigation, but we also do a lot of proactive law and policy development, advocacy, training, education. Prior to joining Lambda Legal, represented young people in juvenile and family court in Alaska, New Jersey, and New York, where I live now. So thanks, everyone, for being here, and hope you stay warm as we proceed.
Do we want to snake around?
Yeah.
So now that you know who we are, there's a bunch of you in the room, so I'm counting on all of you to be quick. We want to sort of snake around and understand where everyone's coming from and what's going on. So if you could just share name, pronoun, like your program name and where you're coming from, and if you are offering, if your program is like trying to offer LGBT specific services or not. Cool? Nothing more than those questions. Yeah, and then we'll sort of snake through.
So my name is Mia Hill, she, her. I am from the City of Philadelphia Department of Human Services. I service everyone regarding housing.
Okay.
Ellie Hernandez, Covered House, New York, he, him pronouns, and we do have specialized LGBTQ programs.
Maya Selkin, she, her pronouns, and I work at Lambda Legal.
Sylvia Thomas, she, her pronouns. I work for Alternatives for Girls in Detroit, Michigan, and we have HUD and HHS funding. We're trying to figure this thing out because HUD's not nice. And it's gender specific more so than LGBTQ specific.
Courtney Smith from Detroit with the Detroit Healing Center. We do not have LGBTQ specific programming, but we serve all young people, and as we know, many of them are disproportionately represented in that homelessness space.
Hi, I'm Dorothy Scott. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm from Humboldt County in California. But yeah, I'm from the Humboldt County Transition Age Youth. I serve as a member of the Youth Administrative Youth Advocacy Board, and we do have LGBTQ services, but I don't think we have specialized services yet. So yeah.
I'm Miss Austin, I'm a therapist. I'm David Meehan. I'm a peer coach in Humboldt County, the Department of Health and Human Services, Social Security branch, transition age youth. And we do serve LGBTQ, but we also serve others. We serve people as well, so bless.
Jason McGill, he, him, and I'm the executive director of a nonprofit up in Bellingham, Washington, so it's north of Seattle, called Northwest Youth Services, and we actually do have specialized services for queer youth. It's called our Queer Youth Services, and housing is one of the things that we're trying to build for young people who identify.
Hi, I'm Susie Powell. I'm from here in DC. I work at the McKay Institute as I came back into the trafficking program, so not direct service provision. So we do not provide services to LGBTQ youth. We don't provide direct suicide like.
Hi, my name is Carrie Rivers. I use they, them pronouns. I work for Family Service in Rhode Island, and I am a direct service provider, but not specifically towards LGBTQ, but there are communities or organizations next to me that do that direct work, here for them.
And Charlotte Prophet, she, her, and I work for Texas Network of Youth Services, obviously out of Texas. And we serve providers, so I'm here to make sure that we're guiding our providers correctly.
Aloha, Carla Hauser, she, her pronouns. I work for Residential Youth Services and Empowerment. We are located on the beautiful island of Oahu, Hawaii. And in addition to LGBT housing, we're also looking to be able to specifically for Native Hawaiian youth.
Beth Edwards-Scott-Lake, I'm the assistant, she, her, I'm the assistant executive director at Youth Services of Tulsa in Oklahoma. And we have LGBTQ two-spirit programming, and we have housing and transitional living, but not specific to LGBTQ. So we're trying to explore that.
Julie Gunther, she, hers pronouns, the executive director of the Wisconsin Association for Homeless and Runaway Services. We're a membership organization, and we do support some services that are collaboratively done. We have some gender-specific programming there, not LGBTQ plus specific, but this is a constant issue for our members throughout the state.
Hello, y'all. My name is Lauren Galloway, pronouns are she and they, and I'm the advocacy coordinator at the Coalition for Homeless Youth. We're a statewide organization in New York, and we have made up of members, and we advocate for runaway and homeless youth, and Alifari Center is one of our members.
Hi, I'm Cheyenne Nichols. I'm the program manager at Non-LGBTQ Project. We serve, both my pronouns are she, her. We serve all youth experiencing homelessness. We're in Southern Oregon. And we have a drop-in resource center and current part of housing program that we're kind of looking to expand into the youth space. So.
I'm Dr. Devendra Young. Where am I from? Bridgeport, Connecticut. I'm Director of Social Work Services for Bridgeport Public Schools.
Jackie Rascal, her. I'm from Bridgeport Public Schools, the homeless liaison. We don't provide direct services for housing, but it comes up quite a bit. How we can provide services for housing accessibility.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Courtney Seals. I'm the Chief Program Officer at LifeWorks in Austin, Texas, and we provide housing, counseling, employment, education services for transition age youth. Not LGBTQ specific, but we do strive for inclusivity and belonging for all of the youth that we serve. So, wanting to learn more.
Hi, Debbie Bushman. I work for NewCap, she, her pronouns, northeastern Wisconsin. We currently have youth-specific programs, and I'm looking at writing more grants for LGBTQ plus specific.
Hi, I use she, her pronouns. pronouns. I'm the Associate Vice President for Covenant House International for Policy and Advocacy. So we have 23 sites, including Covenant House New York, throughout the U.S. All of our sites, they partner with True Colors United, and so we provide LGBTQ specific services.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Taylor Mitchell. Go by she, her. I am from Sasha Bruce. I am at the youth shelter. I'm a case manager. We do serve everyone, but we do not have anything geared towards LGBTQ.
Hi everyone, Tracy Lewis, she, her, Sasha Bruce Newport, you want to say, here in Washington DC.
Stacy. Oh. I'm Stacy Schamberger. I'm from Delaware, Wilmington, Delaware, and a program called Lifelines through West End Neighborhood House. She, her pronouns, and we just started in April. We're providing housing for LGBTQ, but we do have permanent housing, transitional housing, and working towards some other services.
Hi everyone, Steve Cruz, he, him pronouns. I work at the Alifari Center.
Hi everyone, Matt Davis, pronouns are he and his. I'm the Systems Change Manager for the Washington State Office of Homeless Youth. We're a funder of homeless youth services across the state, and also participate in a lot of statewide initiatives. So, I specifically work on our policy advocacy with the state legislature and coordinate initiatives with our state partners in child welfare and juvenile justice.
Hi, my name is Fernanda Huffman. I work for the Latin American Youth Center here in DC. And we have different programs, and one of them is an independent living program specifically for LGBTQ youth.
Thank you so much. So nice to meet you all. I know that took a long time, but also I was like, oh, we've just been in that room together with like so many people, and we had no idea who we're sitting with, so I think it just felt nice to like ground us a little bit in that. All right, so now I'm going to throw it to you first.
If folks who are watching and in the room want to, not obligatory, but you can go to mentee.com on your phone or on your laptop. It's menti.com. And then you enter the code 2861-3246. We have just a few polling questions to get some input from y'all. And you can be on your phone without guilt while you're in the room with us. And before we talk about our main topic today, which is about requirements under federal housing law and regulation, we did want to talk a little bit about what's happening right now because, basically the house is on fire. There's been a really awful time this legislative session for anti-LGBTQ bills. So our first question was true or false? There are over 300 anti-LGBTQ plus bills that have been introduced in state legislatures so far in 2023. Yes, this one is unfortunately true. We are already, even though it's only early March, on a pace to outstrip or may already have done so last year's record number. With some of our usual suspects, no offense to the folks in the room, but Texas, Missouri, Florida, Arkansas, Mississippi, right? Some of those places are leading the way, but there have been bills introduced across the country, right? Even in a lot of so-called progressive states. So this is a word cloud one, so interested in hearing what you're hearing. So what kinds of things are these bills targeting? And you can enter in any constellation of words around what you're hearing. Great. Yeah, so it's spot on. The bill's overwhelmingly targeting trans people, particularly trans and non-binary minors who are attempting to access health care but we're also seeing iterations of Florida's so-called Don't Say Gay or trans law from last year that are trying to out young people to their parents involuntarily, all sorts of things, book bans, limiting school curriculum. Drag show bans are apparently a thing now. Tennessee actually passed a law that has been signed by the governor that has pretty, like a lot of these very vague and sweeping things that could, in some circumstances, just have a trans person be violating the law, just being themselves in a public space around minors. They're really frightening, right? But a lot of it has been focused on gender-affirming healthcare. Folks may know that so far we've had Alabama and Arkansas in past years. Texas, of course, had the directive for DFPS to investigate trans families, trans kids and their parents who were trying to access healthcare for so-called child abuse, right? Luckily, those things have been stopped in litigation from our friends at the ACLU, and we've been involved in litigating the Texas case against DFPS and Governor Abbott. But 3 new states have passed gender-affirming healthcare bans already this year. Utah, South Dakota, and Mississippi just signed theirs. Tennessee has passed both houses and awaiting the governor's signature. The majority of these just limit a provider's ability to provide the care and have civil penalties or licensing penalties. Thank goodness we haven't seen anything passed yet that has a child abuse provision in it or something like that, or directly criminalizes it. But still, obviously, very bad, and we know that it was really hard for trans and non-binary minors to access the health care they need in general, much less, having these limitations placed on it. So we wanted to mention all this because no doubt you are seeing young people who are already facing some challenges and then maybe in a place that are violating these. The other thing that I wanted to mention here that may impact you is both Utah's and Mississippi's laws have definitions of sex that are not accurate according to science and are obviously not trans, non-binary affirming. So they say sex is biological sex based on anatomy at birth and all those sorts of things, right? And sex or gender appears in a lot of licensing regs in places about facilities and who can be in what facility. So they often say, you shall not place a child of 6 years old of the opposite gender or opposite sex together. So most places, sex or gender were not defined at all. So people were saying there was a prohibition, but they were just assuming that that meant sex or gender assigned at birth, even though the law didn't say that. But in some places now, the law is saying that. So that may be a barrier and contrary to federal law as we're here. So these are things that are sort of evolving as we go, but we wanted to flag them for you. And I sort of gave you the answer to this. So what do the gender-affirming healthcare bans target? You can click whatever you think applies. Yeah. Yeah, right. All of them are targeting the provision of medically necessary care for treatment of gender dysphoria. That's the heart of them. Some of them have included declaring some of these things child abuse, this provision of care, child abuse. As I said, luckily those aren't passing. Most so far have imposed civil penalties. All would limit the ability of providers to get licensed if they provide this care, right? So obviously the big limiting factor, because you're no longer going to be able to have your job as a doctor if you're providing this care, right? So how many states have a law now banning gender-affirming healthcare for minor total? For those of you who are doing math while I was talking. So we have, this is a bit of a trick question, because we have Alabama, Arkansas, Utah, South Dakota, Mississippi, 5. Tennessee hasn't been signed by the governor yet, but that's 6. We have Florida that has, by executive action, prohibited Medicaid coverage for gender dysphoria, so effectively eliminating care for thousands of people. And then, of course, we have Texas and Governor Abbott's directive to investigate parents for seeking, which is slightly different, but still obviously, a major chilling effect on parents seeking out care if they're afraid that they're going to be, investigated for child abuse. Okay.
So my role today is just to help paint the picture of what's going on a little bit further than what those polls were doing. So we're services, we're wanting to help our LGBTQ kids. There's all this like legislation that's also saying that, you know, these kids don't exist, and that is not true. And it's actually growing and growing and growing as kids are, you know, generations go on. So this was from a Gallup poll from 2022 showing the huge jump of LGBTQ identified people. So Gen Zs, over 50% are identifying somewhere within the LGBTQ range versus about 30 for millennials, about 11 for Gen X, and 2.2. You know, it's not that more people are queer, it's that when there's more access, people feel free to be it, right? And also, as our culture changes and we have broader definitions about what it means, and we're going against gender as a construct, people are like, oh, I guess I feel that, a fluidity, you know, being able to feel comfortable in that and not having to define something so rigid if it doesn't feel right. The overall US adult population, you can see also majorly growing over the last 10 years, basically doubling of folks identifying as LGBTQ. So the future is queer. We have to be able to provide these services. We need it to be affirming. And so when you're hearing things about this not being an issue, this is something that you can probably take back. In addition to that is the story that they were sharing for a long time about how the overrepresentation of LGBTQ youth in foster care and homeless youth services overall was like just like a New York thing or an LA thing. And it wasn't until 2021 that they went and got some more data from Chicago. So you can see in Cuyahoga County, it's this numbers between Cuyahoga County and New York City are essentially the same. And so that myth that they were putting out there as saying that this isn't an issue, we don't need to fund this in places that aren't like New York and LA, is completely false. And so all of you who don't live in those places, you know, are needing this, even if your COCs are telling you that this is not an issue for specific services. And I'll go quickly through this because I don't imagine I need to share too much about the real difference of why this is important. But from Chapin Hall, you can see this data showing what LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness versus non-LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness, and the vast difference around discrimination and violence is experiencing much more for LGBTQ youth, which is even more of a reason why these specialized services are so necessary, because the risk is just so much higher for our young people. And the needs of ways to support them is also needing to be specialized as well. And even within LGBTQ, there's differences of how we need to specialize it and how the type of care folks need, even broader than just that breakdown.
So I just wanted to share a little bit more specificity around foster care, because I know so many of you are interacting with young people who are in foster care, have had experience in foster care, or maybe or should be in foster care but aren't being picked up by the system. And there's a very particular reason why LGBTQ plus young people are experiencing the foster care to homelessness pipeline at even higher rates. And that's basically because it's sort of every step along the way of what you're supposed to be doing theoretically in foster care is not happening, right, for LGBTQ plus youth like it should. Now, granted, you know, a lot of foster care systems, not good for any kid, however they identify, and some really bad conditions and poor outcomes. But instead of actually having services in the community that folks can access in their neighborhoods and their communities around family acceptance and minimizing rejecting behaviors to prevent kids feeling like they have to leave or being kicked out, those don't exist in the vast majority of places. Even when child welfare gets a call, and they are, and this is a stretch for a lot of places, identifying that the conflict related to the removal has to do with the child's sexual orientation or gender identity or expression, then they're not referring them to any services to help promote family acceptance and minimize rejection, even though we know those are extraordinarily successful. There's 5 or 6 programs in the country that have demonstrated really great results, but they just don't exist in a lot of places in a robust way. So they don't provide them, there's nobody to refer them to, so then you have kids being removed at higher rates, And then the same thing applies for being able to successfully go back home. If you're not providing those services while you're in care so you can get back home safely, then you're remaining in care. If you're not doing the same thing for kin and looking for relatives and making sure that you're encouraging relatives to learn to accept and work with their young people even if they're not, then you're ending up in so-called stranger foster care at much higher rates. Across the country, not nearly enough affirming foster homes for LGBTQ plus youth, with LGBTQ people being a vastly underutilized resource as foster and adoptive parents out there and still facing a lot of barriers to being licensed, some child placing agencies, some states with state laws that allow these contractors to use religious criteria and turn away same-sex couples and LGBTQ people. So that leads us to this overrepresentation in congregate care of all sorts, whether that's residential treatment facilities, group homes, all of that, right? Those places are overwhelmingly gendered, so where does that leave non-binary young people, in the mix in general? And then, of course, many of them are not placing kids consistent with their identity if that's what they want. Not great settings in general, lots of conflict related to gender expression, bullying, harassment. So as we used to say, in Anchorage, when I was representing kids in foster care there, my clients voting with their feet and getting out of there, which means all the things y'all know about, like exposure to trafficking, like all of the stuff, right? Or they're just then ending up in what we sort of call the shelter cycle, which in some places can only be 30 days if you're in foster care and all of that, right? So this means instead of having our what should always be our focus in foster care, which is remaining home safely if you can, returning home if you can, being a relative so you achieve permanency, you're like down this slippery slope and out, which is why we're seeing so many young people that you all are working with who have had foster care experience, because we're missing these opportunities to do better at every stage along the way. And then, of course, there's like the criminalization of young people across the board. And we've heard a lot more lately about the school-to-prison pipeline, as well we should, and the impact on black and brown kids, and particularly black and brown queer kids, who experience policing in school at way higher rates. But there's also a foster care to prison pipeline that we don't talk about enough. Any youth in foster care has a higher chance of police contact and justice involvement, especially too for queer kids and queer kids of color. And then, of course, as y'all know, homelessness, right? Lots of exposure to policing and criminalization in all its forms. And then there's walking while trans, walking while black or brown, walking while black trans person, all of those things exposure contact to police at extraordinarily high levels. So if you are, say, for example, a black trans girl in foster care, you can have all of these things happening to you at once, so your odds of being criminalized work. So all of this to say, like, all of the stuff that you're doing to provide assistance are actually things that disrupt these pipelines, and I encourage you, and we'll talk about a little bit of the good stuff that's coming out of this administration and child welfare, to also, as you're having contact with those places, like, push them to do better, because otherwise we're going to have this constant flow in unless we're really kind of working on prevention, specifically in foster care as well. Okay, let's see. Now I have to do the magic polling. Okay. All right. So now we have a few more polling questions. So we kind of got this answer before, but if you don't mind answering again, are you providing specialized care for LGBTQ plus youth?
What do you mean by specialized?
Sorry, I was told I needed to repeat the questions for the online audience. So they asked, what do you mean by specialized? So specialized services are, so something like the Alifari Center is a specialized service. And what that means is we are LGBTQ youth missioned, and we provide services specifically for LGBTQ youth. Some that might exist within one program in a larger program, but it just means that you are creating and designing your programs to support LGBTQ youth. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Looks like well over half of the folks. Has your continuum of care coordinator, point person, whoever, has somebody told you that you cannot provide LGBTQ plus specific services, or you will be in violation of federal law in some way, shape, or form? Okay, well, hence the reason for the workshop and why you're all here. So interesting to see the numbers are that big. Did you have a question?
So I'm the chair of our COC, and our LGBTQ plus partner is Violate Center, and we've done a lot of work in the youth service space in our COC, and we're still getting the pushback. And so I want to answer on behalf of them, yes, right?
Great.
And I'm like, okay, really? So they just opened a permanent supportive housing apartment center, and we got a lot of pushback, on how they were enrolling, providing apartments to the participants there. A lot, but we fought them. They fought, and we were right behind them, like, come on, let's go, let's go. But yeah.
So I'll try to sum that up for the online audience. So basically the person is from Michigan, runs their Continuum of Care program, or is part of running the program, and Ruth Ellis Center in Detroit has for a very long time provided specialized services to LGBTQ plus youth, and is doing even more in terms of housing now, and is doing that. So I think this is one of the disparities we're kind of highlighting here, is some of you are being told in one part of the country no, while clearly some folks like Ruth Ellis and AFC are doing it, and so there's a right a disconnect, right, between what people are hearing across the country on this front. I think we have one more here. So here's one. I completely understand my obligations under federal housing law. The answers are, I need summer school, or I am a housing savant. So you can enter anything along the scale.
I think in relation to that, what I've learned since doing this work for the last 7.5 years is that you learn, if I'm not speaking to the COC person, I won't know that what I'm doing is a violation until the housing provider says something to me, and they'll say, well, we're not allowed to do it that way, except that we have a contract with you, and you guys never said anything when it was time to rewrite the contract. So
Okay. Yeah.
you learn like haphazardly.
Yeah. So the person in the audience said that sort of learned things in conversation with the folks who are advising them about federal housing law, and that some of the requirements haven't seemed quite clear in the contracts and assurances. A lot of these contracts that I've seen just have like, you will comply with all applicable federal law and regulate, some boilerplate thing, and you're like, all right, well, what is that, right? And then so another reason for us to be having these conversations together, and then also with HUD and their lawyers, so we can get some clarity. We'll talk about that more. I think there may be one more. Oh, nope. I think that's it. That's back to you.
Cool. All right, so now I'm going to show the receipts of why you're being told lies. So I just took a bunch of stuff from HUD and their own language and President Biden that's saying that you can do all your LGBTQ specified services, and in fact, they have initiatives purposefully to do that. So you'll get this whole slide deck needs to be updated in the app, and then we'll have all of this available. And essentially what this big thing is saying is actually them taking responsibility for how their policies in the past have left out Black, Indigenous, people with disabilities, LGBTQ+, experiencing homelessness, and that they're experiencing them at higher rates than the general population because of what it's looked like in the past, right? And so at the end, they promised, this is from their fiscal year 23 performance plan, HUD will address the systemic issues of racism and inequality by understanding and including the diverse perspectives of those who use or would benefit from HUD. And they understand that this is needed, right? So they're acknowledging where they've misstepped and how they're trying to move forward. Got your photo? I didn't want to click it too fast. I know when I hate that. All right, so also from the same performance plan, this is some of their goals, right? And you can see those dates. So this goal was expand housing opportunities and strengthen partnerships to reach marginalized, underserved, and vulnerable populations. And they do want to do that by ensure full enforcement of the Fair Housing Act and Equal Access Rule to combat discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and provide cross-program training on fair housing protections on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, serving the LGBTQ community. So you can do it, right? They're saying that it doesn't violate it because they're straight up saying that these populations are specialized groups, like other specialized groups that are already written into law, and like domestic violence or veterans or other groups that are needing these specialized services. And then June of last year, the White House wrote an executive order addressing LGBTQI homelessness and housing instability. They said that they were going to launch a new working group on LGBTQI homelessness and housing equity. We spoke with them about that. We provided some recommendations around having people with lived experience, having youth on it, having providers from across the country. As far as we know, the working group hasn't started yet. And so we're figuring that out. And so working on identifying these issues and providing guidance that's specifically addressing this disconnect, right? Because their goals, the guidance that they're putting out is, and what is in your applications, right? It's giving you, you're saying, tell me how you're gonna do specialized services for LGBTQ youth so you get points and we give you this money, and then your COC is like, you can't do that. And that doesn't make any sense. And so this is them acknowledging that that disconnect is wrong, and we need them to come out again with some new guidance to eliminate that discrepancy. It's not happening in action the way that they intentionally wrote it. So this, issue came to Curry and myself and then for Y through a bunch of the services that we support. So part of my job is I work with programs that are like the Alifari Center or starting programs for LGBTQ youth across the country and internationally. So if you want some support, hit me up after. But these programs were coming to us and saying these issues, right? So they're coming and being told that they specifically wrote in their HUD application for this, and however the YHTP was in process of implementing this prioritization, and the lead agency on the YHTP stated they could not prioritize because it would violate it. COCs are not assigning points for vulnerability based on LGBTQ, Two-Spirit Plus, and other identities. Providers are being told that they can't have LGBTQ in the name of their organization, and that violates it. And some service providers and several CRCs refuse to ask clients around any of their SOGI data at their centralized intakes and referrals, even to make appropriate referrals to programs that are doing this well or are working to do it, so that a proper referral for a trans young person can go to a program that might have good services for them, right? And so not even asking the questions to provide that is being told that they can't. Okay, so I have a little video from a program in Indiana that I work with in our technical assistance to speak about her experience, especially knowing the privilege we have in New York. So I wanted to let, yes.
A question, and this is something I've come across since I've been working with homelessness, which has been a little over like 7 years. How do you explain to individual LGBT
foul of HUD regulations?
Individuals,
We've worked with our
that because the service is not provided, or just right now this cannot be handled, it's not considered discrimination. Because I've come across a lot of individuals where if the service is not provided for them, or they can't get it right away, it's automatic discrimination. It's like, well, no one actually discriminated towards you. This is just a policy of the program at the moment. So how do you explain that?
Just if you can repeat that to the mic.
I think it may depend a little bit.
If you can repeat the question.
Oh, sure. So if I understand it correctly, if I got your question wrong, that sometimes you're hearing from LGBTQ plus young people that they feel like they're facing discrimination because y'all don't have a particular program specifically for them, although you're accepting them into your services generally. Okay. I mean, we'll talk about fair housing law and all of that. So a lot of it is about eligibility, right? So if you're saying, you serve everyone, sounds like you do, then that's not a violation of fair housing law. Now, there may be some some gray in there if, say, for example, they're not able to be placed consistent with their identity, in shelter or something like that. We'll talk about that. That would violate the equal access rule. There's not a specific requirement under fair housing law that you have to provide specific LGBTQ programming of some sort, although like the Runaway and Homeless Youth Rule requires some training and competency and some of that sort of stuff. So there's a little bit of gray area in there, but I'm happy to talk with you more about kind of what you're hearing. But also I think it's probably understandable, right, that because we know LGBTQ young people and adults face discrimination so disproportionately that a lot of things are, and even if they may not technically be under the law, still feel like it. So, could be a lot in there in terms of what you're hearing.
So can I ask, I just want to say it out loud, I think this is what you're saying.
Yeah.
So you can provide LGBTQ specific housing within a building.
Yeah, we'll talk about that more. Yeah, you can. You can. Yes, I'll explain more about housing law. I think she was having the flip side, right, of that young people who were LGBTQ were feeling like they were being discriminated against because there wasn't specific LGBTQ plus programming in their program, right? So that's a different.
Units themselves, aside from the programming, can be dedicated specifically to LGBTQ.
We'll talk about that when we get to the fair housing law piece. Okay.
All right, so let's hear from Chris.
Hi, my name is Chris Paulson, and I serve as CEO of Indiana Youth Group in Indianapolis, Indiana. In October 2020, IYG was awarded YHDP funding to serve LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness on our streets. This was a prioritized group that we specifically called out in our grant, and we were awarded this grant. In the past 2.5 years, we have struggled to figure out how to serve these LGBTQ youth without running afoul of HUD regulations. We've worked with our local HUD office, national HUD, our local COC, and city officials in Indianapolis to figure out how to prioritize these youth. In Indianapolis, all of our services and shelters are faith-based, leaving LGBTQ youth unserved. We are here to do the work and want to do the work if we can only figure out a way to make the rules and regulations serve the young people that we were granted to serve. Hi.
Okay, so some other issues that are coming up, which are also incredibly problematic, is some providers and COCs are asking questions about people's genitalia in order to place them in particular housing settings, which obviously is really, 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 really wrong and problematic. Part of what they were describing also was not having a place to really report that. There wasn't a system, there's a system for that young person to put in a report, but not really a system for that provider to put in a report, either in addition to the young person, or if the young person's not wanting to do that, but they're okay with you talking generally about the issue. And so that's definitely one of our sort of asks about this, is providing that, and as well as other religious traumatic things that are being asked from religious agencies as well, as long as they're willing to come back to the way of God. Yeah.
I think it is very true that you do have to have staff that are people that are working with young people that identify as LGBTQIA, where they're doing the housing assessments. What we've done, I know for us particularly, for those who are, because we have cross-system work that we do, because the fact that on the child welfare side, we've addressed the youth as what their biological birth name was, sex, all that stuff. But it's not so much about what their sex is, it's about what their name was and what, like, to make sure the information matched.
Mm-hmm.
We did a lot of work around it because people were not knowledgeable and they were offended because we were asking for birth names.
Mm-hmm.
And not by the name that the youth was going by.
Mm-hmm.
Never by the genitalia, but that's the first time I ever heard that. But it takes a lot of work around to make sure that cross-system work is being done, that you're trained well enough to be able to say, not to offend anyone, but so that we can ensure that this particular participant get the housing that they need, because the bottom line is housing is the result that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. In summary, and just correct me if I missed something, but they were talking about how in cross systems, even within the same agency, making sure that things are being done in an affirming way and asking names, and making sure that, I think there was a point around making sure not to offend other people. And that is where like the really training and workshops around like changing hearts and minds, because the offense that person might be feeling about seeing someone's chosen and given name on a piece of paper is nothing compared to what a young person would feel as a result of all of that, right? And so it's one, making sure that all those match, so they're not going to one place and stop looking one way and going another place, looking another, what you were describing, but also that those individuals who are giving that assessment are LGBTQ, and understand how to do that for them.
But I think that they were offended by us asking for birth name, not really understanding that this is a system issue, not a people issue. And they were like giving us pushback, and we're like saying, listen, we're not trying to not identify the youth by the name they identify by. We just need you to give us the real name, because that name is out of the system, and you're going to take away the opportunity that's available to them if you don't give it to them.
And when you say they, because maybe I misunderstood, you're talking about the client or the staff?
The person doing the housing assessment.
The person doing the housing assessment. Yeah, so they're definitely.
They were LGBTQIA, some staff are LGBTQIA, but it's just they're the outreach team. And they were doing assessments, and we would meet, and I would say, well, unfortunately, I don't have any information on this particular youth. Then after a while, I said, well, you're giving me the wrong information. I need the birth name in order for my team to be able to assess to see whether or not this youth can be assigned to this specific housing opportunity.
I understand, yeah.
It's not that we don't want them to have it.
Right.
I just need the correct information.
Sure. Are you asking chosen name as well and preferred name?
We get their name as well, because what we have to communicate is this is the name that the youth goes by.
Yeah, so part of it is the explanation of it, right? And so when I've done supportive housing applications for people in the past, right? So it's part of the explanation of like, okay, this system and the government and everything that's tied to you and your social security number and all that stuff needs your biological name. I am only going to put it in this one spot. And for the rest of the time, and the way everyone else is going to address you, it is by the chosen name that you're also giving me. Even in the rest of the narrative I have to write about you and everything else, I just need to put it here, even though I know that that's not who you are, right? And sometimes just taking the time to make that explanation and understanding that it takes a second, but I've never had someone not understand that when we take the time to just explain the system, right? And so it's when we don't explain what's happening that discrimination is being felt. Yeah. All right. Do you want to pause still? Or do you want to, let's go forward maybe. All right, take it away.
Yeah, and we'll say too, I think like another step can be, as folks are navigating it, is making sure that you're offering assistance to a young person or young adult to get all those things changed. Like if possible, that can be really challenging because of consent requirements from parents and other things, but the National Center for Transgender Equality has a great map with all the state laws and how you can get IDs and birth certificates changed. National Network for Youth has a great program with Baker McKenzie to help folks who need to get their identity documents together. There's a whole system out there, pro bono lawyers helping trans and non-binary young people with getting their name changed. I've heard a lot of child welfare folks say, well, we have to use the legal name. There is no such requirement anywhere, right? They have a legal name that appears on a court docket that they may have to have somewhere in the file, but there's no other requirements anywhere that they have to use a legal name in court reports, in conversation, and anywhere. So, there's a lot there, I think, to navigate. But we appreciate the question. So we're going to talk about federal law and policy. Just have a few more questions here. Okay, so these are sort of, sorry, we'll plug in. Okay.
It's hard to tell right now, but we'll figure it out.
I'll look in a second. All right, so here's the true false. So providers receiving federal financial assistance can turn away applicants because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. True or false? Sorry, we're getting the plug-in situation worked out here. So false. This is the absolute prohibition under federal law, and I'll explain more about why and where it says that, but no, right? And so even though some people, when they say gender identity and sexual orientation, they think they're only talking about LGBTQ people, but we all have a sexual orientation and a gender identity, right? So, it does apply across the board, and that's where I think some of the confusion has played in about providing specialized housing. So we'll talk about that. Okay, here's another one, true or false. Applicants for services, so the folks seeking assistance or services, may voluntarily disclose sexual orientation or gender identity. Absolutely, right? You certainly can, and again, as Nadia was saying, it's about how you ask and the way in which you ask and what you explain to people when coming in. And we'll talk about a specific example where HUD has provided information about how you can go about collecting SOGI information. So if you're hearing you can't from them, that's bizarre because their own documents provide resources on how to do it appropriately. Okay. Next, providers may question or ask applicants to provide anatomical information or, quote, proof of gender. Excellent. Absolute prohibition against that, okay? There are some wrinkles in here that we'll talk about a little bit, which again, I think is why some confusion has arisen, apart from just people being blatantly discriminatory and biased and awful, which is resulting in questions about, anatomy, but also a little bit confusion. Okay. So this is a slight difference from HUD, and now we're talking about Health and Human Services. So HHS is enforcing protections against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in the runaway and homeless youth rule. Yes, right, that is the correct answer. So we'll talk about the RHY rule. So if you're receiving funds through RHY programs, in 2016, regulation was promulgated, which has explicit non-discrimination requirements for RHY programs. Confusion because during the Trump administration, they promulgated a rule eliminating, stripping protected classes from the HHS grants rule, which is the overarching one that applies to all HHS grants, including the child welfare system. We filed a lawsuit, stayed the effective date. That never became the law. This administration admitted error. The HHS grants rule is the law, but the Trump administration also promulgated a rule that they were not enforcing that rule. That still remains, and the Biden administration has not pulled that or taken steps to eliminate it. So across the board, they are not enforcing civil rights protection for folks who are beneficiaries of or participants in HHS grants program, but the RHY rule is a standing reg, and they have said they're enforcing protections on that. So that means you can file complaints with HHS OCR in violations of that.
So, refresh my memory on this, because I thought that in the most recent funding opportunities, the language was not being included yet. So it is being enforced in practice, but it's not being prioritized in funding opportunities.
The HHS grants rule is the law. So I'm sorry. The question was, it sounds like you're hearing that in some of the assurances for HHS grants, they're not putting in requirements from the HHS grants rule in them. Is that
so, and that's also been
okay?
Really like, okay, what's happening this month and what's the conversation? So
Yeah.
it sounds like that's been an ongoing point.
So it has been a bit confusing because the HHS grants rule is the law, the 2016 version that includes religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity as protected classes. So they should be including it in assurances, but they're not enforcing it, which is really unfortunate. So, and we're working on that. Okay. All right. So also wanted to mention before we talk about Fair Housing Act and the Equal Access Rule and the RHY rule, wanted to make sure that you all knew that in 2022, the Administration for Children and Families put out an updated memo around LGBTQ youth in the child welfare system that is very comprehensive and explains to states how they can draw down funds from Title 4E and 4B to provide training and technical assistance, and just kind of spells out what you should be doing for LGBTQ youth in care, including clear prohibitions on stuff that should never have been happening, right? Discrimination, non-affirming placements, all that sort of stuff. So as you're intersecting with child welfare folks, if you're not seeing good policy and practice on their fault, like refer them to this, right? They should be doing this, like the federal agency is telling them to do this. So just wanted to make sure you were aware of that new information that you might find useful. Okay, so the Fair Housing Act, right, does have a prohibition against discrimination when renting, buying, like all of those things, and also applies to federally assisted housing. In addition to just non-discrimination requirements, which includes sex as a protected class, and I'll explain why that's important in a sec. Also illegal to harass people because of their race, color, religion, or sex, threaten, coerce, or intimidate anyone for exercising their fair housing right, or retaliating against anyone who's made a complaint. So the kicker here to make all this explicit and clear was a Supreme Court decision, the Bostock case, which some of you may have been following, which was about federal employment law and non-discrimination in there. In the Civil Rights Act has a provision around employment that includes sex as a protected class. So two cases were brought, one on behalf of a gay person, one on behalf of a trans person, that went to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said sex includes discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So sex appears as a protected class in a lot of federal non-discrimination law. So slowly but surely, the Biden administration has been issuing guidance, making it clear that sex discrimination under the Fair Housing Act includes sexual orientation and gender identity. So that's a good thing, right? So there's a letter. We have links to all of this in the materials that we sent. Interesting enough, also, fair housing agencies and grantees have been required to review allegations of discrimination received since January of 2020 and advise people who file gender identity discrimination claims that their claims may be timely and that they'll investigate them. So that's a good thing. We know there are a lot of barriers to people being able to file these, both practical, fear of retaliation, afraid of what will happen next for them if they do. But we have all the information about the links. So if you're working with people who have experienced discrimination, and they can complain safely or need support, do that. Because one, it shows a record that this is happening out there, that the federal government, and this is assuming we have a good administration that cares about LGBTQ people in the federal government, can use that as a basis to provide more stuff, lay a track record that stuff is happening. So it'll be interesting. I haven't seen any report of what this looked like, but it's something we can ask for. So the other big pieces of federal housing law that I imagine you all have been following along with are the equal access rules. There have been two that have been put out. The main first one was in January 2012, which was basically just one that explicitly said you may not discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in any HUD-supported, HUD-funded housing programs. Then in September of 2016, HUD put out a second equal access rule, and I'll talk about exactly what that did, but that was the one that basically required that folks be placed consistent with their gender identity in shelters and programming. So this is the base stuff that was in the 2012 rule, right, that you may not have folks ineligible or not have them in housing around their sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status, right? And this is where the, I think, piece about confusion about having people voluntarily disclose their sexual orientation and gender identity in terms of demographic information has come in, because the 2020 rule said no inquiries about gender identity or sexual orientation for the purposes of determining eligibility, right? So it's trying to prevent the sort of nefarious use of asking people about their sexual orientation and gender identity, because people would historically and still currently are turning away people who say they're LGBTQ, right? But this has kind of been, I think, where a piece of the confusion has come from about whether you can ask people to voluntarily disclose for purposes of demographic information and to get them connected to supportive services, right? Which is very different than engaging in discriminatory behavior. Does that make sense to folks? Okay. And again, I'll show you an example of where they're providing information about sort of how to do it right, right? The prohibition does not prohibit inquiries about a person's sex where housing is temporary, emergency shelter with shared sleeping areas or bathrooms. So again, this is not a place where certainly a lot of discrimination could and does happen, right? But what they mean here about inquiring about sex is in these situations you are allowed to have gender segregated programming, but what you're doing is asking someone how they identify, and then you're off to the races. You're not then engaging in this invasive inquiry about, well, you know, all the bad things, right, about supposedly having to justify who you are to folks who are asking inappropriate questions. So again, you can kind of see where like there's the little acorn in there of, you know, why some of this is coming from, even though it's not a prohibition. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Okay, so the 2016 rule, again, went a little bit further, that you do have to provide housing consistent with someone's gender identity, and that is a requirement. And again, this was where there's the absolute prohibition against asking any of these invasive questions. Okay, so the runaway and homeless youth rule, right, again, was 2016, and basically required that there be core competencies of youth workers who are working RHY program funded, including around gender identity expression and sexual orientation, right? So say there was a situation where you weren't providing LGBTQ specific programs or services, but a young person was accepted, but they weren't really feeling like they were being respected, or people were getting their situation, or were competent enough to know where to refer to them to resources and do other things, then you could have a violation here of the RHY rule, right? So that's where I was saying there's a little kind of gray space in here, right? And then, of course, this has a prohibition against any sort of discrimination and explicitly includes sexual orientation and gender identity in RHY programming. So I wanted to show you the one piece, this document, the Equal Access for Transgender People, Supporting Inclusive Housing and Shelters from HUD, which had a lot of input from a lot of trans-led organizations, trans folks with experience in care in putting this together, also has this piece of it where you can click to a guide developed by the Fenway Institute in Boston that has forms about collecting SOGI demographic information and explains how to do that. This document is pretty great. It has a lot of like advice on how to put non-discrimination language in your forms and do all those sorts of things. But here, this is what Nadia was alluding to, they are specifically pointing you towards guidance for collecting SOGI demographic information in your programs. So clearly they're contemplating that you can. Again, it's about doing it correctly and doing it right. So the piece then about kind of specialized housing and all of that, where I think it's kind of getting lost a bit in how you say it and how you do it versus what you're doing, so you don't run afoul of federal housing law, is clearly this prohibition on discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity applies across the board. So you can't say, we won't work with you, cisgender person, right? That is discrimination on the basis of gender identity as well. Okay? So what you can say, Alifari Center and Ruth Ellis and other folks do, is we are a program specializing in services for LGBTQ young people, and everyone is also welcome here, right? So, you're not turning someone away. Now, I understand that like the prioritization of certain populations and things like that can get tricky for folks, especially in smaller communities where there aren't other options. So, and I also, just from clients that I've had over the years who are LGBTQ, I know many of them have truly felt safe when it was an all LGBTQ environment, but there is a prohibition against discrimination, right? Support. So I think it is about how you say it and how you do it, and some nuance in there, which I think is a bit of where things are coming up to a head. And that's why on reaching out to HUD and trying to get some specific guidance, and hopefully that, including the involvement of LGBTQ plus people with lived experience, so it actually comes across in the way that Nadia went through and explained why y'all want to prioritize, we need to prioritize, and HUD is telling you to prioritize, and also telling you how to comply, like if that makes sense. Yeah, there's a through line there, but it does require kind of, taking some careful steps in terms of the language that you're using and what you're saying on your forms and how you're going about it. Okay? Nadia, I don't know if anything else you want to add. Like on that front.
Yeah, I think the point you made that stood out to me the most was, especially like it's different for places like New York City where we have like lots of programs that young people can go to versus if you're the only program for RHY in your area, right? So AFC, Alifari Center, can, we prioritize LGBTQ youth. And if a non-LGBTQ youth comes in and requesting services, if there's a more appropriate referral for them, we will make that referral for them and help them get to that. If there's not, at this moment, they'll stay with us until we can make that proper referral. So we're not saying they can't be with us, but we're helping them find somewhere that might be more appropriate. So we're not turning people away. It's either they're getting it or we're helping them find a service that would be good. When you're the smaller program, then that's, it's honestly better if you are an agency that is serving everyone, but centering your, guidance and your protocols and everything around LGBTQ youth. Because if we're creating protocols that are going to be affirming for Black trans women, the most discriminated people, right, then everyone else will feel affirmed, even if they're, it's a mixed group of young people in your program. So figuring out that balance. We were at 10 a minute ago.
Yeah. Let me ask one thing that you ask, and then I'll get back to you. Sorry for pointing. So it would be possible, say, within a program to offer some specialized rooms or housing or situation that contemplate in the equal access rule and in this guidance that you can, say, make sure that you have a section for vulnerable populations as long as that isn't stigmatizing or in one place or just for trans people over here, segregating folks out in a stigmatic way. Yes, but you also have to have it open for everybody, but you can specialize.
But how does anybody if you have to have everybody?
That's where it's about the nuance, right? Of like, as Nadia was saying, like, that is exactly what Alifari Center does, right? And they're in a place where there are some other alternatives and they can make sure a young person is having a comparable alternative that they need. And that may be difficult in other places. And in that situation, you're building it for the population that you need to build it for, but everybody has to say technically welcome, which may not be ideal. I understand that, right? I'm sorry, I wanted to make sure and get to your question.
This has been really, really helpful. So specifically, let's say, you have a wait list, like your shelter's full, and there's a non-LGBTQ plus youth who's maybe been on the list for like 3 months. And then there's like an LGBTQ plus youth who's been on the list for like 1 month. Are you able to prioritize LGBTQ plus youth first because that's your specialty, or is that discrimination?
I would say it depends on where you are and what. Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, say you have like a waiting list and there is an LGBTQ youth that's been on it 1 month and that's your specialty and that's who you're trying to prioritize, and there's a non-LGBTQ youth who's been on it for 3 months, right? Can you prioritize that LGBTQ youth like ahead of the other? And I think the answer would be what the alternatives are in the community and where you are, and if you're able to do something like Alifari Center or possibly in Detroit, you know, and help kids navigate something that's the best fit for them. If you're the only game in town, no.
I agree. This is really helpful for me. So let's say I'm trying to create transitional housing as an example. We're trying to, so we have 3 houses out there. 2 of them are serving everyone. What I'm hearing is we still can't have a dedicated transitional home for our queer youth. Or we can. That's, okay, so
You can. Even within Alifari Center, we have technically 3 different apartment units for 18 trans youth. And that's, so we have a transgender specific housing program even within our other all LGBTQ. So all LGBTQ people can stay at all of them, and that one is only for trans, non-binary, expansive youth.
Okay, so
Yeah.
So also no. So
Yeah, so again, I think it's in the language and in the nuance of like, these are our way of programmings, we have these, they access, you know, all the same services, they're the same type of situation from house to house. This house is specializing in LGBTQ youth, right? We're providing some specialized services, but the basic transitional housing services we're doing are the same for everyone, and everyone's eligible, right? If that makes sense to folks. Let me just do one other thing I forgot to mention about the runaway and homeless youth rule around requiring services and training, and the piece about the exclusion. And we wanted to make sure and get general recommendations out because we're at time, I think. One more question. Does anybody have?
If you're working within your coordinated entry system and your COC, can you prioritize your by name list for particular housing projects based on protected LGBT status, Native Hawaiian status? Can you prioritize those youth?
I think so, again, with all the caveats we've had in mind. So I think it really depends on how that system is operating and what opportunities have and what you're saying to people as they're coming in, right? It's all about not having some eligibility prohibition for people. That's a blanket rule, right? And also making sure that you're not like providing services that are different in, you know, in some way based on a class, right? As you're doing that continuum of care, if that makes sense. Okay. Any final recommendations?
I think the final recommendations are take this information back, talk to your COCs, show them the receipts, and figure out a plan to how to make this happen given what else is being offered in your area, right? And know that you can provide specific services in your program, even if you are someone who's providing for all youth or you want to do something that is LGBTQ specific. I think the main thing is, like us, we can't turn anyone away. We have to provide a service, even though we are very openly saying we are for LGBTQ youth. So that service is going to be a referral or staying with us until we can figure it out, right?
So is it kind of the case then that a lot depends on our ability to advocate for the best interest of the populations we're serving and for our COC to be interested in saying, as we're moving to try to serve youth where they are, who they are, and to stay within the law. Would that be a focus summary?
Yeah, I think the question is, can we then state the needs that we're trying to address, make sure why we're communicating that we're prioritizing certain populations, and also make sure that this isn't exclusionary criteria for anybody, and everybody's ultimately welcome, but we know that these specialized services benefit. Also, we just wanted to leave this slide up that's from the Trevor Project around sources of joy for trans and non-binary youth, because oftentimes all of this is focused on harm and heaviness, and there's that in the world, but there's also a lot of joy, and I certainly get a tremendous amount of joy from the LGBTQ young adults that I get to work with all the time. So we wanted to leave with that. And then we have our contact information here. I have some cards up here. Our information is also in the resource list that we have up on the app. Thanks, everyone.